The word came out of his mouth the way words come out when someone has been holding them for a long time and has finally stopped seeing the point of holding them. We were sitting in the living room of the house I had built in 1988, the house where he had grown up, where he had learned to walk on the hardwood floors I had laid myself over a single long weekend with my brother Raymond, where his mother had made Sunday dinners for 22 years, where every significant thing in his life until the age of 24 had happened. He was on the couch with his wife Tanya beside him, and I was in the chair across from them, and we had been talking for about 20 minutes about what he described as the current situation and what I had been experiencing as my own life in my own home. He said it without raising his voice. He said, "Dad, I have to be honest with you. You have become a burden on this family, and I think we need to talk about what that looks like going forward." I sat in that chair and I looked at my son, and I thought about the hardwood floors and the Sunday dinners and the 24 years of everything that had happened in that house before he had decided I was something to be managed rather than someone to be known. I did not respond immediately. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Thank you for being honest, Derek." I stood up. I said good night to him and to Tanya. I went upstairs to the room that had been mine for 35 years. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I began to understand with a clarity that only arrives when something you have refused to see is finally placed directly in front of you, exactly what I was going to do next. My name is Edward Marsh. I am 71 years old. I was born the second of 4 children in a small house in rural Kentucky to a father who farmed 40 acres of tobacco and a mother who kept the household and raised 4 children and stretched every dollar with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that efficiency was not a preference but a survival skill. I left Kentucky at 18 on a partial scholarship to study business administration and never went back to live there, though I went back every year until my parents passed, and I have carried Kentucky in me the way people carry the places that formed them, not as nostalgia but as foundation. I built a career in commercial real estate development over 4 decades, starting as a leasing agent in Cincinnati at 23 and ending as the principal of my own development firm in Tennessee at the point of my retirement 6 years ago. I developed office parks and mixed-use retail centers in 2 significant residential communities, projects that required the management of capital, contractors, municipal relationships, timelines, and the particular human complexity of getting large groups of people to move in the same direction at the same time without losing the thread of what you were building. I was good at it for 40 years. And then I retired, and my wife Helen passed 14 months later, and my son decided that the man I had been for 7 decades was a burden on his family, and I sat in the dark on the edge of my bed and I started planning. Helen and I met in 1979 at a real estate conference in Nashville where I was attending as a young professional, and she was working the registration desk while finishing her degree in interior design. She was the most organized person I had ever encountered, and she had an eye for space and proportion that I had never developed, and that I came to rely on in both our home and my professional work, in ways that I acknowledged to her privately and should have acknowledged more publicly, and do not get the opportunity to correct now. We married in 1981. We had 2 children. Derek, born in 1983, and a daughter named Pamela, who was born in 1986 and who lives in Seattle, and who calls me every Sunday, and who drove to Tennessee from Seattle in a rental car when Helen passed, because she said she was not going to let me be alone in that house for the first week. And she was right, and I was grateful in a way I did not fully express, and that she did not require me to express, because Pamela has always understood what is meant without requiring it to be said. The house was mine and Helen's in every sense that a house can belong to people. We had designed it together on paper before we hired the architect. We had chosen every finish and every fixture. I had laid the hardwood floors in the living room and the hallway with my brother Raymond over a long weekend in September 1989, and Helen had brought us sandwiches and sweet tea and had sat on an overturned bucket in the hallway watching and making observations about the spacing that turned out to be correct. When she died, the house became the place where she was most present and most absent simultaneously, and I stayed in it because leaving felt like a second loss I was not prepared to absorb. Derek was a good child in the ways that matter when children are young and a complicated adult in the ways that matter more. He had been sharp and driven and had gone into finance, had done well, had married Tanya in 2012, had 2 children of his own, had built the kind of upper-middle-class professional life that looks from the outside like the full realization of everything a parent works toward. What I had not fully accounted for, what I had seen in pieces over the years but had assembled into a complete picture only gradually, was that Derek had developed a relationship with money and position and social presentation that had the quality of anxiety rather than confidence. He needed things to look right. He needed the correct car and the correct neighborhood and the correct associations and the correct version of his family narrative. Helen had seen this earlier than I had mentioned it to me once in the careful way she mentioned things she was uncertain about, and I had nodded and filed it and not returned to it because Derek was our son and I did not want to see what she was showing me. After Helen died, Derek became more present in my life in a way that I initially read as concern and later understood as management. He came by more frequently. He asked more questions about the house and the finances and what I planned to do with the firm's remaining assets and the commercial properties I still held. He introduced me to a financial advisor he trusted, a man I met once and did not hire because something about the meeting felt like an audition for a role I had not agreed to play. I told Derek I was satisfied with my existing financial arrangements. He said he just wanted to make sure I was protected. I said I had been protecting my own interests for 40 years and was confident in my ability to continue. He said, "Of course, Dad." He said it the way people say of course when they mean not for long. Tanya was not a malicious person. I want to be fair about that because fairness is a discipline I have practiced my entire professional life and I am not going to abandon it when it is personally inconvenient. Tanya was an anxious person who had married an anxious person and who managed her anxiety by organizing and controlling the variables in her environment. I had become a variable. A 70-year-old widower living alone in a large house 40 minutes away who required Derek's attention and whose continued independent existence represented an ongoing demand on a schedule and an emotional bandwidth that Tanya was already managing to capacity. She did not dislike me. She had decided that I was a problem to be solved and that the solving of it was taking longer than the timeline she had projected. Derek's expression of this, the word he had chosen, burden, was Tanya's assessment delivered in Derek's voice. I knew this when he said it. I did not say it then. I am saying it now because I think it matters to be precise about where things come from. The conversation in the living room did not arrive without warning. There had been a year of smaller signals that I had observed and noted and not acted on because I was still calibrating what I was seeing and because I had not yet decided what response the situation required. Derek had mentioned twice in 6 months that the house was a lot to maintain for one person. He had mentioned once that there was a very well-regarded senior living community 20 minutes from his house that he had toured and thought I should see. He had asked me on 3 separate occasions whether I had thought about consolidating my financial accounts, a question that had no apparent purpose other than to understand the scope of what I had. He had introduced me to 2 different estate attorneys in the space of 4 months, framing each introduction as a resource rather than an agenda, and I had met both men and had found them competent and had not hired either of them, and had noted that both of them had professional relationships with Derek that predated my introduction to them. I had my own attorney. I had had my own attorney for 26 years, a woman named Caroline Reese who had handled every significant legal matter of my professional and personal life since 1998, and who knew my situation with a completeness that made the suggestion that I needed a new introduction patronizing in a way that I had chosen, at the time, not to address directly. I addressed it after the living room. I slept 4 hours. I was awake by 4:30 and I did not try to go back to sleep because the thinking I needed to do was going to happen whether I was horizontal or vertical, and I preferred to do it at my desk. I made coffee. I sat down. I took out a legal pad, the same kind I had used for 40 years of development projects, yellow, wide-ruled, and I wrote at the top in my own handwriting the same way I had started every significant planning exercise of my professional life. I wrote the date. I wrote the objective. The objective was stated simply: restructure everything in a manner that accurately reflects my actual relationships and my actual intentions and that cannot be altered, influenced, or anticipated by anyone who has not been invited into the planning. I wrote for 2 hours. By 6:30, I had 4 pages of notes covering assets, structures, relationships, timelines, and questions for Caroline. I called Caroline's office at 8 o'clock and left a message saying I needed an appointment as soon as she had availability, and that it was not an emergency but that it was important and that I would appreciate her earliest opening. Caroline called back at 8:45. She had a cancellation at 11. I was in her office at 10:55. Caroline Reese was 61 years old, had practiced estate and business law for 33 years, and had the quality of a person who had heard every version of every family and financial situation, and had retained the ability to be neither surprised nor judgmental, which is a rarer combination than it sounds. I sat across from her and I told her the full picture, not just the living room conversation, the full picture, the year of smaller signals, the 2 estate attorneys, the financial advisor. Derek's questions about the house and the commercial properties, my 4 pages of notes. Caroline listened with the focused stillness of someone who is building a structure in their mind as information arrives and who is not going to start talking until the structure is complete. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a moment. Then she said, "Edward, tell me about the commercial properties." I told her. I held 3 commercial properties at that point, all in Tennessee, all generating rental income, all owned free and clear. A strip retail center outside Knoxville that I had developed in 2001. A small office park near Nashville that I had acquired in 2008 at a price that the financial crisis had made favorable. A warehouse distribution facility on the outskirts of Chattanooga that I had developed as part of a partnership in 2011 and had bought out my partner's shares in 2018. Combined appraised value at current market was approximately $3.2 million. Combined annual rental income was $214,000. Caroline wrote down those numbers. She said, "And the house?" I told her the current appraisal. She wrote that down too. She said, "And liquid assets?" I told her. She wrote that down and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. Let's talk about what you want the picture to look like when we are finished." I am going to describe the structure Caroline and I built over the following 6 months in broad terms rather than specific legal detail, because the specific detail is Caroline's professional work and because the specifics matter less than the principles and the outcomes. The first element was the commercial properties. All 3 were transferred into a limited liability company that I controlled entirely, with a management structure that documented my active involvement in the oversight of those properties and that established clear succession provisions that reflected my actual intentions rather than assumptions anyone might make about default inheritance. The rental income continued to flow to me through the LLC. The properties were no longer assets that could be easily identified and assessed by someone doing informal research into my financial position because they were held by a corporate entity rather than directly in my name. The second element was the house. I made the decision that I had been approaching for 2 years and that the living room conversation had finally moved me past deliberating about. I listed the house. It sold in 22 days for $940,000 to a family with 3 young children who walked through it on a Saturday morning and whose youngest daughter ran her hand along the hallway wall where the hardwood floor met the baseboard, and I thought about Helen sitting on an overturned bucket watching me and Raymond work, and I knew the house had found the right next chapter. The third element was the estate documents. Caroline and I rewrote everything from first principles, the will, the trusts, the beneficiary designations, the healthcare directives, the power of attorney provisions. Every document was rewritten to reflect my current understanding of my family and my relationships rather than the understanding I had held before the living room. Pamela was central to the new structure. Derek was not removed. He was repositioned in a manner that accurately reflected his actual relationship with me and his actual history of engagement with my life and well-being, which the preceding 2 years had defined with considerable clarity. I purchased a condominium in Nashville, a city I had worked in for decades, and that suited me in the particular way that cities suit people who have spent enough time in them to know where they work and where they do not. The condominium was on the 14th floor of a building in a neighborhood I liked, 2 bedrooms, a study, a kitchen that was smaller than the one in the house and that I found I did not mind because I was cooking for one, and a smaller kitchen focuses the effort in a way that I came to appreciate. I set up the study with the desk I had worked at for 30 years, which I had moved from the house because it was the one piece of furniture that was entirely mine in a way that Helen's things were entirely hers, and that I was not going to leave behind. I had the desk refinished before I moved it because it had accumulated the marks of 40 years of use, and I wanted to bring it into the new chapter looking like itself at its best rather than like a record of everything that had happened to it. Caroline's office was 12 minutes away. Pamela flew in for a long weekend the month after I moved in, and we bought groceries and cooked dinner 2 nights in a row and talked about Helen in the way that Pamela and I can talk about Helen, directly and without performance, saying what we actually remember and what we actually miss without dressing it up in the language of grief management. It was the best weekend I had had in 2 years. I told Pamela that. She said she already knew. The commercial properties continued to perform after the restructuring exactly as they had performed before it, which was the point. The Knoxville Retail Center had 2 anchor tenants who had been in place for over a decade and whose leases were structured to renew at rates favorable to both parties. The Nashville office park had occupancy levels that had remained above 90% for 8 consecutive years. The Chattanooga warehouse had a single tenant, a regional logistics company, on a long-term lease that had 3 years remaining with 2 renewal options built in. Caroline had a colleague who specialized in commercial property management, a firm that took over the day-to-day tenant relationships and maintenance coordination and reported to me monthly with full documentation. I reviewed the monthly reports at my desk and made decisions when decisions were required, and otherwise allowed the properties to function the way well-structured assets function when they have been properly managed for long enough that the management itself has become the asset. The annual income was deposited into accounts in the name of the LLC and distributed to me on a quarterly basis. I lived comfortably. I gave meaningfully to 2 charitable organizations that Helen had supported throughout her career, one focused on rural education in Kentucky and one focused on pediatric cancer research, because her causes were part of her legacy and her legacy was part of my responsibility. I did not think about the word burden. I thought about what I was building and who I was building it for and whether the shape of it was honest. It was honest. That was enough. Derek called me 3 weeks after the living room conversation. He called with the careful voice of a man who is not sure which version of the previous conversation the other person is still carrying. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He asked about the house. I told him I was considering my options. He did not know I had already listed it. He did not know about Caroline or the LLC or the estate revision or the Nashville condominium I had already identified. He knew none of it because I had not told him and because I had, in the weeks since the living room, conducted my affairs with the same privacy that I had always brought to significant professional decisions, which is to say that I shared information when sharing it served a purpose, and I did not share it when sharing it served only to invite interference. Derek and I spoke 4 more times over the following 6 months, calls that were civil and informational, and that covered nothing of substance because I had decided that the substance of my life was not something I owed Derek access to until the structure was complete and the decisions were made and there was nothing left to influence. He did not know the house had sold until I told him after the closing. He did not know about the commercial property restructuring. He did not know about the revised estate documents. He did not know about Nashville. He found out about all of it in a single conversation I had with him on a Tuesday evening 6 months after the living room, a conversation I had prepared for with the same attention I brought to significant professional negotiations. Which is to say, I knew exactly what I was going to say and in what order, and I had considered his likely responses and prepared for each of them. And I was not going to be moved from the position I had arrived at by anything he said in that conversation, because the position had been arrived at over 6 months of careful thinking, and was not a reaction to a word but a response to a full picture. I called Derek on a Tuesday evening in October. He answered on the second ring. I told him I wanted to update him on some decisions I had made and that I wanted him to hear them from me directly and completely in a single conversation rather than in pieces. He said okay with the carefulness of a man who senses that the conversation is going to be significant. I told him I had sold the house. I told him the sale price and the closing date and that I had moved to Nashville. I told him about the commercial property LLC and that the properties were performing well and were being managed professionally. I told him that I had revised my estate documents with Caroline and that the revisions reflected my current understanding of my relationships and my intentions, and that Caroline held the documents and could answer procedural questions if he had them. I told him that Pamela had been included in the planning because Pamela had been present in my life in a consistent and genuine way, and that the estate structure reflected that reality. I told him that none of this was a punishment, and none of it was irreversible if our relationship developed in a direction that warranted revisiting the decisions. I told him that the word he had used in the living room was not something I was going to discuss at length, because discussing it at length would give it more weight than it deserved, and I had decided it did not deserve that weight. I told him that I loved him because he was my son, and because love is not conditional on behavior even when behavior has consequences. I told him that I was open to a different kind of relationship than the one we had been having, and that the terms of that different relationship were simple, which was that I wanted to be known rather than managed, and that if he could offer me that I was interested in it. Then I told him I hoped he had a good evening, and I ended the call. I sat in my study at the desk I had refinished, and I looked at the city lights through the window for about 20 minutes. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner. Derek called me back 4 days later. The voice on that call was different from any version of Derek's voice I had heard in the preceding 2 years. It was not the management voice or the careful voice or the voice of a man conducting an assessment. It was something closer to the voice of a 30-year-old who had just understood something significant about the gap between who he intended to be and who he had been behaving as. He did not make a speech. He said, "Dad, I think I need to apologize to you for more than one thing, and I am not sure I know how to do that well, but I want to try." I told him I was listening. He talked for about 10 minutes. He talked about Tanya and the pressure of the life they had built and how that pressure had expressed itself in ways he was not proud of. He talked about the word burden and said it directly, acknowledged it, said he had known when he said it that it was wrong and had said it anyway because he had been tired and had stopped seeing me as his father and had started seeing me as a problem, and that was a failure of character that he owned completely and not a reflection of anything I had done or been. He said he was sorry. I told him the apology was accepted and that it mattered to me that he had made it. I told him that the decisions I had made were made and were not going to be reversed on the basis of one conversation, but that one conversation was how different things begin and that I was willing to begin. He said, "Okay." We talked for another 20 minutes about his children, my grandchildren, who I had not seen in 4 months and who I missed in the specific way that grandparents miss grandchildren, physically, the way you miss something you can hold. He said he would bring them to Nashville the following month. He did. Pamela knew pieces of the plan as it developed because I had kept her informed in the way that you keep the person you trust most informed when you are making significant decisions. She did not know the full financial picture until I sat down with her in Nashville and walked her through it during the long weekend she visited after I moved. We were at the kitchen table with coffee, and she was in her practical mode, the one she brings to significant information, asking precise questions and listening to the answers before asking the next one. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, do you know what Mom would say right now?" I said I had some ideas. She said she would say it is about time. I laughed. Pamela laughed. It was the right thing to say, and it was accurate, and it landed in the way that true things land when the person saying them knows exactly what they are talking about. Helen had always had a clearer view of Derek's trajectory than I had allowed myself to have. She had said what she needed to say once, and then she had let me arrive at my own understanding in my own time because she respected my process even when she was ahead of it. I had arrived. 14 months after her death and 6 months after a word in a living room, I had arrived. Derek brought his 2 children to Nashville the following month as he had said he would. His son Marcus was 9 and his daughter Claire was 6, and they were the age where grandparents are still interesting and the world is still full of things that have not yet become ordinary. I took them to a park on the Saturday morning. I bought them ice cream in the afternoon, even though Derek made a face about it being close to dinner, because some grandfather prerogatives are worth the face. Claire sat in my lap on a bench near the water and told me a long and complicated story about something that had happened at school, involving a misunderstanding about whose pencil case was whose. And the story had 4 or 5 plot developments, and a resolution that she was clearly proud of, and I listened to every word of it with the full attention it deserved, because it was the most important story being told anywhere in my vicinity at that moment. Marcus asked me about the buildings we could see across the water, and I told him about development and construction in terms a 9-year-old could engage with, and he asked 3 follow-up questions, each of which was more precise than the last. And I thought about Derek at 9 asking me questions about the projects I was working on with exactly that quality of precision. And I understood that the things we pass to our children do not always arrive where we expect them to, and do not always look the way we imagine, but they arrive. They arrive. That evening, Derek and I sat on the condominium balcony after the children were asleep, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything important. And it was the most honest conversation we had had in years and possibly ever, and I do not know exactly where it leads, but I know it is the beginning of something that is better than what it replaced. I have not told you the full financial picture in specific numbers, and I want to give you enough of it to complete the story honestly without compromising what Caroline advised me to keep private. The 3 commercial properties were valued at the time of the LLC transfer at $3.2 million combined. The house sale produced $940,000 net of closing costs. My liquid assets, the investment accounts, and the pension and the savings that 40 years of disciplined earning and saving had produced represented a figure in the same general range as the property values. The total picture, when Caroline and I reviewed it in her office in the final meeting where we signed the completed documents, was a number that began with a 7 and had 6 figures after it. Caroline looked at the summary sheet and said, "Edward, you have built something substantial." I told her I had had 40 years and a very good partner. She said, "Helen." I said, "Yes." She said, "I know." I could see her in how this was structured. I did not respond to that immediately. I looked at the summary sheet for a moment, then I said, "She had a better eye for proportion than I did. I just followed her line." Caroline smiled. She said, "That is a very good way to build something." I agreed with her completely. I want to address the word directly one final time because it is the word the story turns on and it deserves to be addressed fully. Derek said I was a burden. He said it on a couch in a house I had built in 1988 in a living room with hardwood floors I had laid with my own hands. He said it because he had been under pressure and had stopped seeing me as a person and had started seeing me as a demand on his resources and his time and his carefully managed life. The word cost him the house. Not in the sense that I sold the house as a response to the word. I had been moving towards selling it for 2 years and the word accelerated a decision that was already forming. But the word cost him the version of the story in which his father's estate was structured around the assumption that Derek was the reliable, engaged, present son, and that the estate should reflect that. The word cost him the financial arrangement that would have been in place if the living room conversation had never happened. What the word produced was a 6-month period of silence and planning that ended in a restructured estate and a set of documents that accurately reflect my life rather than the life I had wished I was living. In that sense, the word was clarifying. In that sense, it was the most useful thing Derek said to me in the 2 years after Helen died. I am not grateful for it, but I used it. I used it the way I have used every hard thing in my professional life, as information about the actual shape of the situation rather than the shape I had been assuming. My name is Edward Marsh. I am 71 years old. I grew up on 40 acres in Kentucky and left at 18 and spent 4 decades building commercial real estate in Tennessee, and retired with a portfolio that represented 40 years of disciplined work and good judgment, and the partnership of a woman who had a better eye for proportion than I did, and who I miss every single day. My son sat on a couch in the house I built and told me I was a burden. I said, "Thank you for being honest." I went upstairs. I sat in the dark on the edge of a bed in a house I had lived in for 35 years. And I began to plan with the same clarity and the same patience and the same structured thinking that I had brought to every significant project of my professional life. 6 months later, the house was sold and the properties were restructured and the estate documents had been rewritten. And I was sitting on a balcony in Nashville watching the city lights and making dinner for one in a kitchen that was exactly the right size for the life I was actually living. My son said I was a burden. I walked away in silence. I left with the full accounting of everything I had built, organized, protected, and directed according to my actual values and my actual relationships, and I am spending what remains in exactly the way I choose. The burden, it turned out, was never mine to carry. I just needed someone to say the word out loud before I could finally set it down. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me your own story if you have one. Every voice in this community matters, and there are more of us out here than any of us knew. Subscribe if you have not already. There is always more to come.